information event on the Apprenticeship Action Plan, or the next Apprenticeship Action Plan from 2021 to 2025. And as Trudy's mentioned, my name is William Bosang. I'm the Assistant Secretary in the new Department of Further and Higher Education, Research, Innovation and Science. And I have responsibility for kind of the tertiary education system and also for skills policy. And of course, apprenticeships sort of reside in the intersection of those two areas. I know there's a wide range of participants here this afternoon attending this seminar, but I'd like to welcome in particular Pat O'Doherty, who's chair of the Apprenticeship Council, who have obviously played a seminal role alongside all the other stakeholders in driving forward the agenda on apprenticeships over the last couple of years. So I'm very happy to have been invited to introduce this afternoon's proceedings, and I'd like to thank all of you for your virtual attendance this afternoon, and indeed for your participation in the process of developing the Apprenticeship Action Plan to date. And you know, more than that, I suppose, given that everybody that's here and scanning the attendance list before we kicked off talking to the team, I know all of you and you know, very many of you and the organisations, institutions you represent will have played a very important role yourselves in the kind of the delivery of a very significant programme of reform in apprenticeships over the first action plan. And of course, the continued development and kind of enhancement of Ireland's, you know, apprenticeship model is highlighted strongly in the programme for government. And the overarching objective in the programme for government is that apprenticeships play a much larger part in the education landscape in Ireland. The PFG talks about apprenticeships being open and accessible for all. And really a core objective is that they're seen as a viable and exciting path for school leavers. And I suppose, given the performance of the apprenticeship system to date, and obviously there's a long established tradition and history of apprenticeships, and then more recently, we have the evolution that's occurred over the last couple of years in terms of the new apprenticeship model. So, I mean, the opportunities that have been realised, and indeed the challenges that we've seen overcome to date, you know, including the COVID environment, highlight the huge potential for apprenticeships to play an even greater and more central role in the delivery of the sort of, you know, absolutely crucial economy-wide skills agenda. Because Ireland's apprenticeship model, I mean, it provides that sort of structured, blended, occupationally focused education and training that equips apprenticeships with the knowledge, the skills and expertise that accelerates their progression into attractive employment opportunities and sets them really on, I think, a really strong career trajectory. And that should be our objective, or that certainly is our objective across higher and further education. So the PFG sets out a number of ambitious targets for growing the number of apprenticeships and apprentice registrations. So they underpin, obviously, the work that's been done on the plan, strengthen the role of apprenticeships in the green economy and in other new and non-traditional areas, and then also talks about improving the pathways between second level and apprenticeship, as well as, and not to understate the importance of improving or increasing the participation of women and other underrepresented groups in apprenticeships. So the purpose of the session this afternoon is to feed back on the key issues and themes that have emerged from a number of different strands of the consultation process, which undertaken with stakeholders, which was launched by the ministers in early August. And we hope through the Q&A to sort of have a further engagement, notwithstanding the constraints of the current environment, the virtual environment, on that agenda. So we're going to start off with a presentation from Anne Ford, who's been working as a consultant with the department on the preparation of the plan. And she'll talk about what's emerged from the submissions we've received. That'll be followed by a presentation on the results of a survey of SME employers by John Costello, who's the Regional Skills Forum Manager from the Midlands. My colleague Trudy Duffy, who you've already met, will then present on the results of the survey that's been carried out with apprentices themselves, which is really an important input into the work on the plan. And that'll be followed by a wrap up on the key issues from my colleague Phil, who leads on the preparation of the plan. And we'll be into the opportunity for Q&A. So I suppose that there's a lot of ground to cover, and we're sort of looking forward to it. But I mean, just to reiterate, I mean, from the Minister's perspective, Minister for State for Skills as well, you know, the delivery of PFG objectives, as I've kind of outlined, is a primary goal of the new action plan. And in that context, it's really important that policy development is strongly guided, informed, and advised by the expertise and experience of key stakeholders like yourselves. I mean, the knowledge and insights, as we'll hear through the presentations, that you've contributed to the consultation process on the development of the new plan is, you know, really is invaluable to us. So I'd like to thank you for that. I mean, I suppose the obvious point, you know, probably more so than any other aspect of higher and further education, the success of the apprenticeship model depends on fundamentally on the collaborative engagement and commitment of a broad number and range of different stakeholders who sort of each individually and collectively play a key role. So employers, unions, training providers and HE and FET, public bodies, the NGOs that are kind of focused on access, all under the aegis of the national governance structures provided through, for example, the National Apprenticeship Advisory Council and the Apprenticeship Council, are crucial. So we want the new action plan to be really anchored in the perspectives, in your perspectives and insights, and that's what we're working to achieve. So I think in summary, I mean, I think there's, you know, it's sort of very, there's great, I think, excitement and energy in the whole apprenticeship domain. And I mean, those of you that follow Minister Harris on Twitter would have seen him speak passionately about the potential of apprenticeships and the apprentice model, and his commitment to the transformation in this area, and his objective to provide leadership. And I think that kind of commitment and support is a really good basis to drive the agenda forward. So really just want to hope that you benefit from from what you hear this afternoon from the presentations that we've lined up. Thank you for your attendance again, and hand over to, I think it's Anne's coming in next with the first presentation on the result of the consultation process, the submissions we received. So thank you for that.
And I think you're on mute there.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Yeah, okay, good afternoon everyone. As William said, I'm going to take you through the written consultation process, which, as you know, started last July. Trudy, can you move on the slide there? Thanks. Yeah, the consultation process, as you know, started when the Minister published the consultation paper back in July. That consultation paper, I suppose, covered every aspect of the apprenticeship system and sought your inputs on all of those aspects. By the end of September, we had received just over 60 written submissions. However, in preparing a number of those submissions, a number of bodies also took further consultation with their respective memberships. So that considerably extends the reach of the written consultation process beyond the 60 submissions that we have received. I think both the breadth of the submissions and the depth of issues that are covered in them, I think really, as William said, it has given us a really clear insight into the operation of the system from the perspectives of those who are already familiar with it and who are involved in the delivery of it. We also received a number of submissions from organisations which address the issue of how we can increase access, increase diversity for apprenticeship, and I suppose expand the reach of apprenticeship. Given, as I said, the breadth and the depth of those, and sorry, I think I should have said also as well, I think the intention is that they will be published so everybody can see them all. But forgive me if I don't hit on every aspect of all of them, but what I'll try to do is maybe give you a sense of the key themes in all of the submissions. So do you want to move on to the next slide, Trudy? Thanks. I think I've put this slide up. These are just maybe some comments from there, or some quotations from the submissions received. And I think in terms of a general overview, what really comes across strongly is the value which is placed on apprenticeship, and also the very significant level of ambition that there is for the system. You know, if you look at these, you know, where we have one company who initially was going to take on 3 or 4 apprentices has ended up taking on double that number. As I mentioned, some of the submissions were around the whole issue of access and diversity. And one of the organisations who represent people with disabilities again made the point that, you know, apprenticeship, the scope and the potential for apprenticeship is just huge in terms of supporting people of all abilities, and indeed a really strong commitment there from that and from other organisations around, I suppose, helping the design and the development of apprenticeships in such a way that they will be accessible and become more accessible. The very, as I said, really strong sense from the lot of the consortium groups about the sheer level of time and commitment that people have put into this, you know, to get new programs up and running, but also very much the sense of commitment there is around, you know, the programs that have been in place and have been in place for, you know, for a number of years. I think this sense of forward-lookingness, if that's a word, in the submissions is really strong. And as William said, you know, picking up on where we are now, which is probably very different to where we were when the process to start the action plan started because of COVID. But fundamentally, though, the role that apprenticeships can play in driving innovation, increasing productivity, and really, you know, being a sort of a strong source of collaboration in delivering, you know, relevant programs across both further and higher education. Can you move on there, Trudy? Thanks. Okay, so maybe just, and again, this is a very skim through maybe what's working well. There is a real sense in the submissions received as well that we're starting from a very strong place in terms of the experience of the traditional craft apprenticeships and for the new programs that have been developed. There was a very widespread view that the core features of what constitutes an apprenticeship in Ireland are robust, while they may be based in the 1967 legislation and have been developed through administrative rules and guidance since then. There is a view that they have stood the test of time and that they meet the requirements of an expanding apprenticeship system. Now, that's not to say that there weren't issues also raised around the legislation, and particularly maybe around some prohibitions around expanding it into other sectors and areas where it could, you know, maybe be improved on and brought more up to date and more reflective of I suppose the business environment that we have now and the changing roles of stakeholders, I suppose, and everybody who's involved in the thing. But I think it was really important to stress, though, that the core piece around apprenticeship and the core protections that's afforded both to apprentices and the responsibilities on employers are regarded as solid. I think also what comes very through, as I mentioned previously, is this very clear recognition that the craft apprenticeships, you know, have really provided the bedrock for the system. And there's a strong emphasis in submissions on you know, how to ensure the quality and the relevance of those programs moving forward, both in order for them to be able to evolve in line with industry needs and also very much the needs of apprentices. And a huge number of submissions, or sorry, rather there's a huge number of suggestions throughout the submissions in that regard. There is also a very clear recognition and a welcome for the progress that has been made to date under the Apprenticeship Council, again, as referenced by Williams. But, you know, that the extent in a relatively short period of time to which the number of programmes has grown, and I suppose that a whole infrastructure around processes and systems to support the rollout of the programmes has been put in place is acknowledged. There may be frustrations with different aspects of it, but I'll go back to that later. But there's also, I think, widespread recognition from nearly all of the submissions that came in. People were familiar with the generation apprenticeship branding and a lot of the initiatives that have been taking place under the Apprenticeship Council to promote apprenticeships more generally. Again, the other sense is this strong sense of collaboration, and that's between the stakeholders, both within maybe the new consortia type steering groups, where, you know, you've providers working very closely with industry, but also more broadly, and there is sort of a sense of those engagements taking place both on an informal and on a formal basis, and people working together to work out how the system should be working, you know, and how they can make it, I suppose, as effective as possible. I should also say a very strong recognition too of the role of SOLAS and the Secretariat there, and the other agencies too, in supporting the Apprenticeship Council, in supporting all of the stakeholders. But a very clear desire in the submissions to see opportunities for further stakeholder involvement enhanced and developed. So can you move on, Trudy? Thanks. The next one. So as I said, the submissions also very evidently covered challenges with the system. Some of those I think maybe would come under a category of almost like a work in progress. There's a lot of new processes, there's a lot of new systems. Some of that takes time to bed down, but certainly issues around, you know, time frames, lack of clarity at maybe program level, lack of clarity over roles, a lot of frustration coming through in that regard. More fundamentally, though, I think there's a very clear view that the overall system governance that is there is complex. And while a feature probably of how the system has developed, I think the lack of clarity, having two dual governance systems operating side by side, has really come to the fore, I think, and very strong calls throughout practically all of the submissions we received for the need for more coherent governance structures, clearer roles, clearer responsibilities. Another issue that has been highlighted quite clearly through the submissions is the whole issue of the different approach that this governance model has resulted in terms of, I suppose, the funding models across the consortia-led programmes and the craft programmes, with a particular emphasis on the issue of the funding of the off-the-job training phases for consortia. That seems to be particularly evident where there are requirements in the new programs for periods of block release. And that is clearly imposing significant cost requirements on the employers involved who are paying the wages during that time. There also is an issue in relation to, and I think, sorry, it comes through too, that's a particular issue for SMEs, for smaller companies. Also, in relation to the overall funding model, I think there is a view, certainly among the consortia, quite clearly expressed around the current funding model and whether it adequately covers the upfront costs of developing an apprenticeship programme. And there have been a number of proposals put forward throughout for a review of that model, that it should be looked at and reviewed. But as I said, some of these are relatively newly rolled out models, and I suppose the whole operation of the process. So that's also a factor. But the extent to which the funding model, I think, or the differences in the model is acting as a barrier to participation by employers is clearly articulated in the submissions. The other theme I think that comes across very strongly is the lack of awareness among employers and among potential apprentices really about what apprenticeship is. And while I said earlier, there's a strong view that the core features of apprenticeship are solid and robust, I think there's an equally strong view that the manner in which a definition of apprenticeship is communicated needs to be made much more attractive. And it needs to focus on the employers, on all stakeholders, on parents, on young people as well. So that's in terms of, as I said, this is a very, very high level run through this. A lot of detail in the submissions about specific aspects of the operation of both the craft and the consortia programs, and proposals for change in relation to both. So can we move on, Trudy, to the last slide, please? Thanks. So I suppose if I was to sum up of everything in that we have seen in the submissions, and if you'd like to say what I would say maybe are the key messages coming through from the submissions. As I said, this need for a single coherent governance model, need for clarity around roles and responsibilities, and also to take account of the changing roles and the responsibilities and the remits of a lot of the key, I suppose, the key players in the apprenticeship space in terms of the state agencies, the education and training providers. Their roles have changed and evolved significantly over the last, particularly maybe over the last 10, 20 years, and a clear sense of a need for that to be reflected in the arrangements going forward. As I said, very clear message around the disparity in the funding approaches between the craft and the consortia. Overall, that strong message around just the process needs to be easier to engage with. The processes, the systems of duplication, the ongoing operation of the system, and I suppose the promotion of the system. This piece about communicating a much more attractive and an accessible definition of apprenticeship. And also all of the submissions have focused on specific proposals and suggestions in relation to supports for SMEs, financial supports, but also non-financial supports, and also for apprentices and for underrepresented groups. But again, maybe just to recap slightly, a very, very clear sense coming through that you all want to be involved in working on the development of the plan and in the development of the system moving forward. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Anne. I think we'll just keep motoring through the presentations just so that you have a sense of feedback from all the areas. So next we have John Costello from the Regional Skills for the Midlands, telling us all about the employer feedback.
Yeah, thank you, Trudy, and thanks everyone for joining in. I suppose firstly, I'd like to thank my colleagues, and I think a few of them are on the call here today, in relation to help and the work in sourcing information from our SMEs. I think it's fair to say, if you just next there, Trudy, comes up on the map, yeah, and I think most people know who we are, and Regional Skill Forum Managers. There's 9 of us throughout the country, and we would work with mainly SMEs and also multinationals on the whole skills, critical vacancies, signposting as well. So that's what we're here for. Next slide, please, Trudy. I suppose our ask, Trudy and Anne would have contacted us when we went on a call, and probably late in the process, to be honest. We had a 3 to 4 week time frame, and it was agreed that we would try and reach out to our database, mainly our SMEs, and use a tagline, I suppose, to try and get some momentum on the survey. How can we help to provide a better apprenticeship system in Ireland for the SMEs? Our process was to reach out to our contacts and ideally try and engage with companies, SMEs that are not engaged in apprenticeship before. However, I think it was important to note we would not be aware whether they were or weren't, and we would have been, I suppose, dealing with them. We would know some that are involved, and I suppose more importantly, we might know some that weren't involved. So we collectively, the forum managers, we designed a short questionnaire, a few short questions. We kept it fairly simple. We asked them what was their awareness of apprenticeship, craft or non-craft, and we were even conscious of their awareness of craft and non-craft. We didn't want to use pre-2016, post-2016. So we're conscious even how we phrase that. Then we asked, I suppose, the reasons for not getting involved or hiring apprentices, the general experience if they were involved, and how could the apprenticeship system be more attractive to them as employers, and any additional comments to inform the new Apprenticeship Action Plan. So the following is some feedback we got. I suppose the sample size, again, we reached out, and we would have reached out to a lot on our databases as well. Approximately 340 companies would have responded. It varied across the country, across the regions as well. Looking at it then from the awareness level of it on the craft apprenticeships, about 65% of people we would have reached out to were aware of the craft apprenticeships, which left 35% who weren't. On the new apprenticeships, probably the opposite, which 25% yes, they were aware, and 75% not aware in that case. I suppose the apprenticeships hired, it was interesting as well, and it varied across the country. Of those that had a knowledge and were involved and had a knowledge of apprenticeship, approximately half, sometimes slightly less, sometimes slightly more, to be honest, were involved in delivering some of the apprenticeships, whether it was the craft apprenticeship or the new apprenticeship. And I suppose the awareness was mainly due to employers having previously completed an apprenticeship, involved in an apprenticeship, or a direct link to some of the people on the call here, whether it's the consortiums or the industry leads as such. Next slide, please. I suppose the next one, we looked at the general experience of apprenticeships if the companies were involved. I suppose it'd be fair to say that there were some very positive sentiments towards the apprenticeship model in Ireland from some of the companies. The apprenticeship, I suppose, it gave them an opportunity for their sector. It more or less gave them a platform where they can be involved in the whole leading design of apprenticeships. And while they welcome that, it also, the time involved in that was a little bit of an issue, how much time they can dedicate to being involved in curriculum and design, etc. I think, as Anne alluded to it, there's definitely feedback on that the scheme is very top heavy, and a lot of paperwork, and I suppose the expense for the sponsoring companies, and I have a slide on that later on as well. I think they expressed that in a lot of cases the SMEs are competing with the multinationals for apprentices. and that would be a concern as well. And also that we'll see a little bit later on the pool and how to access apprentices. Definitely the block release for the SMEs and mainly the craft. The block release is proven very problematic for the companies. And I suppose the disruption that's caused and the inability to get suitable backfills. I suppose bearing in mind the SMEs might have under 10 people employed, some of them might have 10 to 20. And as the apprentice, I suppose, becomes more experienced going through the phases, whether it's phase 4 or 6, and having them released for a block is problematic, especially if there's work on as well. There's also, I suppose, concern and no doubt during COVID and the waiting list. I think one employer said his contract, the learning contract or employment contract, would have extended from 4 to 6 years. I suppose one comment from one of them as well was the better ones tend to move on after being fully qualified. So that's a comment from from an employer who I suppose bit of frustration there that we're qualified, the employer gives the time and ultimately them to move on. But so that happens, I suppose, in all occupations. And I suppose for reasons for not getting involved in hiring apprenticeships, and these are the ones trying to capture these. There's quite a bit on it. Absolutely, the lack of awareness of apprenticeships came across, and not just the craft apprenticeships, also the new apprenticeships, etc. And it was amazing some of the feedback when we reached out to some of the people in hospitality, retailing, completely unaware that there was an apprenticeship in their area. Availability of apprentices, where do you go? Oh, we could spend, I suppose, half an hour talking about that. A lot of frustration, I suppose, from employers, especially SMEs who want to take on apprentices. And examples, I suppose, given more, they no longer knock on my door looking for an apprenticeship. Going back in time, you used to go to contact the technical school, technical college, which became the vocation schools, which now I suppose are community schools and part of DTBs. Frustration, and I suppose, in contacting just local further ed centres. And again, it's just looking for somebody that they might have an interest in apprenticeship. I think as well, there was one or two comments on this year proved very problematic this summer, whether it was COVID or whether not contacting companies who normally would take on 1 or 2 apprentices. The level of applicants and the number of applicants was way down. And they would have been some of the traditional apprentices as well. In some cases as well, I suppose that our business is too small and opportunity has never arisen, which would be fair to say as well. Some employers will say that our work is best described as general operative. However, I suppose part of our role as well is working with companies on their vacancies. They have vacancies at operative level, whether it is in manufacturing, whether it is in the food processing, whether it's in logistics, warehousing as well. So there's probably a niche there for maybe an apprenticeship at that level or a traineeship or some level to try and engage, I suppose, some formal learning at general operative as well. Releasing apprentice for long duration, again, it is a huge issue. I suppose on some of the more newer apprenticeships, there's issues with having a mentor, the flexibility in having a mentor. And now I know some of the various consortiums are working with them, and absolutely looking for more support. What they're saying there, I suppose, is the work patterns have changed, shifts in place, etc. as well. And what was interesting as well, I think it was on 2 occasions where they said, basically looking for mentoring and coaching skills. So we're there as coaches and mentors, and ideally we would love if we got mentoring and coaching skills. I do know, and I'm conscious that some of the new apprenticeships offer that as well, but maybe that was something that some of the SMEs were definitely looking for. Okay, Trudy, I suppose, how would the apprenticeship system be made more attractive for employers? It's definitely communication. There is a huge, I suppose, void there, not alone national, but also regional. More, I suppose, need for fairs and craft fairs, etc., to promote them. And also, I suppose, some of them, if there was a need for a local register for potential apprenticeships, not alone apprenticeships, I suppose, but even where potential apprentices could go. And there was also talk that maybe, and a buy-in from some employers that love to get involved in giving work experience to some of the TY students, etc. So it's a point of contact, I think, that the SMEs were looking for in particular. Definitely looking at the whole regional and national promotion campaign, and I suppose more of a regional focus as well. I suppose the overriding concern is the financial. Huge feedback on that, and areas covering, especially small and the SMEs, where they might have to go on block release. Is there any way the state could cover their salary for 1 to 2 years? Is there any waiver on employer PRSI? And I suppose that the next one as well was an induced targeted supports. I mean, what they were saying there, I suppose, could be means tested and have a direct relationship to the size of the company and turnover, and that might I suppose, direct more financial support towards the SMEs and taking apprentices on. I think it is as well 1 or 2 comments on, while the current bursary is there and announced and extended for 3,000. The SMEs are saying that is available to everybody. It's available to the multinationals. It's available to everybody. So I suppose it might something that might look at giving them a more favourable opportunity, a chance to take on apprentices. Interesting on the structure as well. I mean, 2 or 3 comments on that. 1 or 2 would have suggested a part-time apprenticeship, and that deliberately did say take on more female working patterns are part-time, and so maybe we could look at a part-time apprenticeship. This was an interesting one as well. It came from some of the SMEs, mainly in the manufacturing and the engineering background. Could you rotate apprentices? And I suppose where they're coming from there is they're small. They might not necessarily have, I suppose, all the key skills that the apprentice needs to acquire. And I suppose more importantly, they mightn't have or give a commitment that they have work over the next 2 to 3 years. So they were looking at, is it possible that there could be a way that the apprentice would follow the skills, or more importantly, might follow the work, and it might make it a lot easier as well for them. Block release again came up on the structure. Some of them would have quoted the old release, 1-day release. Some of them, I think it's on my next slide, I want to go on to it, look at the block release as well. So I suppose any additional comments to inform this new Apprenticeship Action Plan? Yeah, it's fair to say that the apprenticeship needs to be relevant, up-to-date, agile and flexible in the delivery methods. So bottom line, what they're saying there is that, I suppose, keeping skills relevant, keep them up-to-date, agile with regard to how it's delivered. We all have seen how the education has transformed to online, but it's also, I suppose, conscious that there are skills that the apprentices have to go to acquire as well. This was interesting. It's probably coming from somebody who was in the old FOS ANCO. If the first year of an apprenticeship could be completed in a training centre, an education training provision, and I think where they're coming from there was that ultimately then they have acquired basics of skills. They've covered all the angles of digital skills as well, which is needed. And I think 1 or 2 would have mentioned then it might even help to tackle the numeracy literacy issues that are coming. But more importantly, I suppose, when they come out after this 1 year, that they're more attractive, especially to the SMEs, and at least I think they're going to give something back to their employers. But also more importantly then that it might structure the next releases rather than having 10 or 11 week blocks as well. The lack of visibility of employers in the region participating, that's interesting. Some of them were more conscious to know who else is involved, they'd like to work together. I mean, we would work and would have got some of this information to myself and my colleagues. We work with cluster groups across the country, and is there any, could they work together? Could they work together on the next one as well? Steps in the process for a new apprenticeship. Basically, the whole program evaluation is time consuming, cumbersome, was one suggestion. Could a group, a cluster together and come forward with suggestions for apprenticeship? Also, I suppose, when the call comes, not too sure when the call is going to be, and more importantly, could it be, I suppose, on demand, and that when groups or employer bodies come together, that to get in, I suppose, and get their heads around an apprenticeship and get it through as soon as possible for approval and validation. This is an interesting one, and I suppose no guess where this one came from. A notification time for block release, I suppose one employer put on it, if we have to put up with the block release, could we not have an online booking? And they compared it to the NCT centre. And what they were looking at there was, while the block release is scheduled nationally or is scheduled by the regions, they really have no control on when their apprentice is going to be released, but more importantly, I suppose, where they're going to go. And that came, I suppose, there were concerns where employers might have to go to apprentices have to be released to go to different parts of the country. So there was a suggestion there that if the employer could, they know they have to release them if the block release is there, could they book them themselves online, maybe try and get them more local, and more importantly, at least they know when they're down to go then over a duration of time. And I suppose my own background was coming through the FOSS and the ETBs. I know the concerns there, there's dropouts and backfilling courses as well. They just are looking for, I suppose, some level of visibility on when employee and apprentices are going to be released. I suppose this was interesting while the employers and the mentors were looking for mentoring and coaching training as well. It was interesting that some of them mentioned that there's also, I suppose, a fear of keeping ahead of the apprentices, because and they would have mentioned one or two of the apprenticeships where the skills are absolutely excellent they're getting, but the mentors and the coaches, and in some cases the employers, I suppose that the skills are nearly ahead of them. So that there's a cry out there, maybe that we could help on upskilling some of the mentors and coaches as well. And also, I suppose, look at the whole RPL was mentioned there in particular. So I suppose overall it was positive. I think the lack of awareness, marketing, both locally and nationally, would be a concern. And the financial is huge for SMEs, I suppose, taking into consideration where they are at the moment with the COVID-19. But it is interesting, I think, if you get out there and we get information out to, I worked with a small group of engineering companies, a little working cluster, and none of them had an apprentice. And I have a meeting scheduled with the local ETB for this Friday. For 8 of them, you only have to fill out the questionnaire and go back to them. Now have an interest in taking on an employer. But I mean, that just probably came about as I started taking on an apprentice. That just came with, I suppose, an understanding of what the apprenticeship is about and the flexibility of the ETB to come on board as well and try and fast track it. So in essence, thanks for the chance to present on behalf of the SMEs and thanks to my colleagues. But that's what the SMEs again, there were some good submissions and a lot of detail. So I just tried to summarise this into a few short slides. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, John. And I think it's really interesting to see particularly the view of people that haven't been engaged with apprenticeship. So I think these are the views that we really need to take on board, like why aren't people engaging, be that employers or, as we're about to see, apprentices, and kind of potential reasons why people may or may not engage. So I'm up next, as if you haven't heard enough from me already. So we obviously we have the written submissions from the different organisations, and many of you are represented here today. We then got the views of the employers who may or may not have engaged in apprenticeship, and then we also conducted a survey of the apprentices themselves. The methodology here, we used some software that we actually had in-house. I know one of the comments that came in on the survey was like, why are you spending so much money doing surveys? And the answer is we didn't. We did it on available software that we had in-house. We sent a link, or should I say Sulla sent a link to the online survey to all registered apprentices that they had mobile numbers for. We had an incredibly fast response. I think we had upwards of 1,000 responses within a day or so. That was supported by the education training providers and the consortia who had been told that the link was going out. The questionnaire or the survey was open for 6 days from the 21st to the 27th of October. So that was over the bank holiday weekend in October, and it was quite interesting as you were able to go in and actually see the kind of numbers go up hour by hour as people were answering their surveys, and that happened on an ongoing basis. So a lot of engagement. We were really delighted with that. In the end, we got 3,750 responses from across all the apprenticeships that were recruiting at the time. So that was 20% of the population towards the end of October. From the responses, we had just under 92% were from craft apprentices. So that compares to about 89% of the population. So craft apprenticeships were slightly overrepresented in the answers that we got. 16% of respondents didn't give their programme, but had enough other information, like almost every other field in the survey was complete. So we included those responses. 4% of the respondents were female. So that compares to 4.5% of the general population. Now, while the survey was sent out to all registered apprentices, we had 73 respondents who indicated that they completed their apprenticeship programme and 18 who had left without completing the programme. So that was quite interesting. And it's a pity that we don't have a huge amount of time today to go into all the detail, but it's very valuable information to get those 18, see why they left the programme, see why they left without completing. And it gives us some really valuable kind of feedback for the future. So the findings of the survey, just some very, very quick indicators here. 75% of respondents had completed the Leaving Cert, 9 were holders of Junior Cert qualifications, 5% were a degree level or higher, 18 people had completed a pre-apprenticeship course. And one of the interesting things, I didn't break it down, we had additional indicators for people who were at level 5 or level 6 certification. There were a number of people on their second apprenticeship program, so they had completed, say, for example, an apprenticeship in carpentry and were now going in to do electrical. So which was quite encouraging from the point of view of, you know, progression and people upskilling and reskilling across different areas. In terms of the employer profile, I think this was very much as expected, really. But just to re-emphasize the difference between the employer cohorts, between the consortia-led apprenticeships and the craft apprenticeships. So consortia-led, we had 31% of respondents were in small or micro enterprises, 69% were in medium and large. I think it was actually 47% were in companies with over 250 employees. So very much focused towards the large employers at the moment for consortia-led apprenticeships. The craft apprenticeships, 66% were smaller micro enterprises, which again is pretty much as expected. I'm just going to skip this one. So this was very much just looking at the breakdown of qualifications for apprentices across the craft and the consortia area. We will be circulating the slides afterwards. I'm just conscious of time, but there were people at all levels in all programs or across both the craft and the consortia-led, which is quite interesting. This slide is not designed to terrify people. It's more to look at trends. So what we did in the survey is we brought apprentices through their journey. So how did they find out about apprenticeships? How did they access the apprenticeship once they knew about them? What were their experiences during their apprenticeship journey? And any recommendations that they'd have to make their apprenticeship program better. So on this slide, we have two sets of information. I'm just seeing if I can find a way of, no, I can annotate here. So what we have on the left-hand side here is craft apprenticeship. So here's craft apprenticeship, and on the right-hand side are the consortia-led apprenticeships. Within each of these, the colour, the fact that there's a number there indicates that an apprentice kind of found out about their apprenticeship in the manner indicated. So on the left-hand side, we have friends and family. Then we have career guidance counsellors, so either within the school, or others, job advertisements, intro centres, careers fair, and other ways. So how did you find out about your apprenticeship? And what we're looking at in this grid is where the white is. So where is not working and where are people not finding out about apprenticeships from? So you can see quite clearly with the craft apprenticeships, so the group on the left-hand side, we have very much friends and family. As expected, I know in the career guidance survey, friends and family again were one of the primary kind of methods for people to determine kind of a career choice. But you can see here with the career guidance counsellor, the second row in, a lot of craft apprentices were referred from the guidance counsellor, whether that's in school or otherwise. And we have quite a group, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different sets of apprenticeships were advised from the Intrio centres. When we look at the consortia-led apprenticeships, so this is this group on the right-hand side, you can see a lot of white space. And that white space indicates that we haven't got the message through to career guidance counsellors in schools, other career guidance counsellors, or Intrio centres. So different routes of accessing apprenticeship are not facilitating access to the apprenticeship programme. We're not getting the message through to guidance counsellors either in schools or adult education guidance counsellors, and we need to also touch base with the Intrio office as well to see what advice they're giving to individuals who may be seeking employment. It's probably very much a function of how new the apprenticeships are, of having to bed them in, but I think it certainly gives food for thought as to how can we actually emphasise how people can access apprenticeships. Once people hear about their apprenticeships, once people hear about and know that the apprenticeships exist, then how hard or how easy is it for people to actually access those apprenticeships? So here we had a statement that we asked the apprentices to respond to, so whether it was or wasn't easy to find an employer to take them on as an apprentice. So you can see here the yellow is 25% of people said that it was hard for them to find apprenticeships, and another 7% essentially said it was very hard. So they strongly disagreed with the statement that they were able to find an employer easily. On the right-hand side here, you can see that the consortia, there's a difference between the consortia and craft apprenticeships in how easy or how hard it is for people to access apprenticeships. So 34% of the consortia strongly agreed that it was easy for them to find an employer. 50% agreed, so 84% either agreed or strongly agreed that it was easy for them to find an employer. And on the craft side, 66% agreed or strongly agreed. But that means that 16% of consortia and twice the number of that in craft apprentices didn't find it easy to get into the apprenticeship. Now, we have to remember that these are the apprentices that actually registered, stuck with it, found an employer and registered. So we do need to make it easier for apprentices to actually be able to access the apprenticeships once they know about them. Once the apprentices actually got into the programme, we asked them how they found the programme. So here we can see we asked them whether their apprenticeship had up-to-date or their perception of whether their apprenticeship programme had up-to-date and relevant content. So you can see that there's a breakdown there between consortia and craft, but on the right-hand side, it's 85% of people felt that they strongly agreed or agreed that the programme had up-to-date and relevant content. When we asked people how satisfied they were with their apprenticeship experience, 82% were either satisfied, very satisfied, or fairly satisfied. 18% weren't, and that's something that we do need to look into. We did leave a lot of open text fields in the survey, and apprentices did use that. I think we were surprised at the amount of free text responses that we got as well to support the quantitative information that we have here. So we're still going through that. But the very interesting thing is, despite the fact that 18% indicated that they weren't particularly happy with their own experience, only 9% would recommend an apprenticeship to a friend or a family member. So, over 90% were actually willing to say, okay, despite the fact that they may have not had a great experience themselves at the current moment in time, that they would definitely recommend the programme to somebody, which is interesting. And we looked at some of the rationale maybe why people weren't particularly happy, and we have to remember that we issued this survey after a period, or in the middle of a period of COVID restrictions, and the impact that those restrictions have had on apprentices across the board. So here we have a breakdown of the COVID impacts on apprentices while they were on their job phases of training. So 43% had no impact there on the left. The next highest number is 40% were either on PUP or because they were on temporary layoff. We know that there's a number of additional apprentices or their employers were availing of the workplace subsidy scheme, so the TWSS. Quite a few. We can see there are 269 or almost 8.5% of the respondents moved to remote working and kept training. Now, obviously, these are very much dependent on which program somebody was in or which apprenticeship that they were following. In relation to experience on the off-the-job training, over 50% had their off-the-job training postponed. We were aware of that, like the off-the-job training elements for craft apprentices were closed from March to September. A lot of work went on in the background to allow people to complete their assessments, but there was large disruption to the off-the-job training elements. So we, in some way, we expected these results. For apprentices who weren't either on off-the-job training due to be off-the-job training if they were craft apprentices, or those apprentices who were in most of the consortia-led programs, there was either a change to the timing of the off-the-job elements of their programs, or their off-the-job training just moved online, so there was less disruption, but again, very much dependent on the sector that the apprentices were engaged in. Now, what we did ask as well is, what was your worst experience during the apprenticeship to date? And I think that very much kind of supports kind of some of the rationale for people not necessarily kind of having a great experience at the moment themselves, but still being prepared to recommend the apprenticeship to others. So very much you can see in there COVID, waiting for phase and college. So this goes back to the high number of craft apprentices that responded to the survey, and most likely down to, you know, their experience of delays in off-the-job training because of that big loss of kind of capacity due to COVID. Now, to balance that, we also asked people what was the best thing about their apprenticeship. And what came across very richly in the information that came from the apprentices was the sense of satisfaction that apprentices were getting from actually working in the program. So here we can see being able to understand the common issues and their solutions going on in my own plant, in my own home without thinking. I realized the knowledge was after sinking in. So they're getting the practical elements, they're learning the off-the-job kind of theoretical and practical elements, and the information like is becoming embedded in their psyche. Being able to quote regulations to clients, a second-year consortia-led apprentice obviously felt that he was gaining experience there, he or she was gaining experience there. And then every day is a new experience where I work. I've picked up a lot of skills and I'm only coming towards the end of my first year. Other feedback that came back were one individual, you know, had helped his class all pass their exams. Pretty much the first time people were able to do things on their own came back very strongly. So it's that sense of learning. And we also did a workload on this one, and this is almost my penultimate slide here. So very much the concept of learning came across. They're working, they're learning those phases, getting experience, making friends. So there's a very rich kind of experience, and the learning concept obviously, you know, is coming across very richly and featured in the feedback. So the initial kind of findings from the survey, the apprentice voice, it's part of the program review process and the key QI validation process is very much to engage the full range of voices across the programs. But that's not necessarily something that we've looked at in terms of system feedback. So it's being looked at very much at the program level, but we haven't done it very well for the system. And I think the results of the survey, there was massive engagement. There was far more than we expected. You know, we didn't have to go and chase people to get responses. And, you know, that's something that we need to bring forward to make sure that people get that opportunity to feed back into the future. Access to information came across, and I think this is probably common with some of the presentations that we've seen already. Looking at waiting times, looking for access to off-the-job training. I think that was some of the feedback that came back from the employers as well. So very interesting to see it mirrored from both sides of the coin there. Clarifying support mechanisms for apprentices and employers. A lot of the feedback that came back, there was lack of clarity in terms of, apprentice entitlements. There were some areas where potentially, apprentices were taken on for a period by the employer before they were actually registered as apprentices, and that would not be in keeping with the actual apprenticeship procedures. So very much need to kind of reinforce the information that's out there and to provide additional information both to employers and apprentices. I think you'll agree with me that what came across from my hugely horrible and difficult yellow and green slide earlier was that we need to improve the access of and access to career advice and the visibility of apprenticeships, and in particular the consortia-led apprenticeships. We had 8% of registered apprentices got their information through kind of guidance counsellors or career type services. Like that is something that Generation Apprenticeship is working on. Like we have to remember that this is feedback from apprentices themselves, and all the activity that is actually ongoing at the moment and is working its way through the system may not necessarily be seen by the apprentices yet. Only 4% had applied through apprenticeshipjobs.ie. So again, making those roles and the job opportunities more visible to apprentices is once we get the employers involved, we need to let the apprentices know that the jobs are there. And then the apprentice supports in terms of widening access. So again, it very much goes into the visibility of apprenticeship. We did ask apprentices as well whether they felt supported in the workplace, and whether they felt supported on their off-the-job training as well. And we have feedback there that we may need to make sure that those messages get through to apprentices that there is facility there for them, both to clarify issues with employers and to provide supports and feedback for themselves. So I'm going to pass you on now to Phil. I think you've heard enough from me for the day. So Phil.
Thanks a million, Trudy, and thanks everyone for joining. You'll be delighted to hear this is the last part of the presentation, and we can have an opportunity to answer some of your questions after this. If you could just move on there with the slide. So in trying to kind of pull together the various threads that have been identified by people in the various parts of the consultation process, we've kind of attempted to put together some sort of high-level draft objectives for the plan that will that we will be organising the plan content, the actions, the recommendations around. So it'll emerge as a kind of a coherent document that's clearly responsive to the issues that were being raised with us. So the first objective there, and I think it came through probably most strongly from the submissions process that Anne mentioned, and I suppose is maybe of primary concern to people who are engaged with the system currently and are attempting to navigate it, attempting to understand it, so that there would be a single apprenticeship system that has a clear governance framework, that stakeholders are involved at all levels, and that the funding model around apprenticeship and the support are equitable and transparent. We have, as you know, made a huge amount of progress over the last 5 years, and even a little more than that. Huge contribution made by an awful lot of stakeholders right the way across the system. With I sit both on the National Apprenticeship Advisory Committee and on the Apprenticeship Council, and the commitment that people bring is enormous, and along with, you know, all of that input that we've gotten from the huge range of people involved in consortia, employers, education and training providers. But of course, what that means is that apprenticeships are kind of a complex enough beast. You know, as William said, it operates at the intersection across, you know, between education and training, and employers in the economy more broadly, and staff and learners and their representatives, unions, and all of that as well. Which means it's really important that people are brought together in a coherent way, that it's easily understood, and that I suppose we in 2015 and beyond, you know, there was an enormous work done to generate a much broader set of apprenticeship opportunities. You know, and a lot of the work that was done there was to establish a new set of governance arrangements, not necessarily to try to kind of you know, produce absolute kind of clarity as between, you know, apprenticeships that were of much longer standing and newer apprenticeships. But clearly, this stage, and it's come through really strongly in the submissions, you know, we need now to be presenting apprenticeship as a strong, clear option for learners, for employers, in a way that's really readily understood under a coherence governance model. We've also seen, you know, there's lots of references across really, I think, all of the pieces of feedback you've heard from John, from Trudy, talking about the apprentices themselves, and from Anne in terms of the submissions, that you know, understanding you know, what's the funding, the funding model, how do you obtain funding to develop an apprenticeship, what elements of the costs are met by the state, whether that's in terms of, you know, running a consortium, paying apprentices, supporting mentors and all of those that are involved in training on the job, and how, you know, providers themselves costs are met, education and training providers as well. It's done in different ways across the system, and you know, there's a very clear message coming through that, look, it needs to be clearer, and it needs to be fairer, and that's coming through very strongly. So I mean, you know, it's a clear message that's coming through the system. Important also that when we talk about governance here, you know, people sometimes kind of jump to sort of shorthand thing. This is all about, like, you know, these national bodies, apprenticeship councils and advisory committees and all of that. But governance here is right the way across. It's right the way down to how programs are governed, how each individual apprenticeships are governed, how employers interact with education and training providers. So it's very fundamental how the system operates at all levels. Also, the commitment to quality was really clear throughout, from education and training providers, from employers, you know, really wanting to offer a really good quality experience to apprentices. I mean, obviously also to train them to the highest standards so they can be as productive as they possibly can be, and can contribute to the workplace in the strongest possible way. But really from apprentices themselves, you know, seeking you know, a really high quality experience. And also that, you know, it needs, and John, you know, referenced this, needs to be very much at the cutting edge, needs to be scanning the horizon all the time around emerging skill needs to be innovative, needs to be agile, needs to be flexible. And we've seen, as apprenticeship has moved into a number of new areas, and also, you know, some of the responses we've seen since March, you know, there is a huge amount of untapped potential in the system. You know, people really engaging strongly and coming up with imaginative solutions to some of the problems that have been encountered, and a hugely diverse set of programs developed now over recent years as well. In order to do that, you need to have really strong quality assurance arrangements to kind of offer confidence to everybody in the system. But also, apprenticeships need to be clearly tailored to the needs in each of the apprenticeships, and they're not the same in every apprenticeship. It needs to be tailored to the needs of the apprentices themselves, to the employers. So, what sector does it operate in? What type of what's the pattern of work in those sectors? What's the nature of work? And indeed, education and training providers as well. I mean, they also have requirements from the system, but that need to be, that each apprenticeship is very much meeting the requirements of those operating in the area. The word proven is mentioned here as well, being proven to deliver the highest standards of learning. I think, and that's really a nod towards, look, we need a strong evidence base around apprenticeship. Trudy talks about, the first comprehensive survey of apprentices for a long time, for example. That's the kind of thing we need to be doing more regularly. Outcomes need to be closely monitored. I mean, by those who are running the programs, and indeed nationally as well, with strong feedback arrangements locally around the programs also. So the third objective there, coming through. Look, we all recognise there are no apprenticeships without employers. It needs to be, employers need to value apprenticeships. They're hard-headed. It really needs to deliver for employers. Some of that is in what we talk about in terms of being tailored and flexible. But we understand they have to make sense from a cost perspective. The system has to be easy to engage with, easy to understand. And also, apprenticeship really needs a footprint right the way across the across the economy, including some of those areas with really significant levels of employment that we haven't seen apprenticeship penetrate thus far. And when we talk here about employers, we're talking about public sector employers, we're talking about private sector employers, we're talking about large employers, we're talking about smaller employers. Apprenticeship needs to be able to serve all of those different markets, and there's a clear requirement for the public sector to put its money where its mouth is as well in terms of engaging with the apprenticeship system. We talk about the value proposition for employers. I mean, there's also a value proposition for institutions, education and training institutions. It's really important that our institutions are engaging with apprenticeship and that they value apprenticeship not as being separate to their core mission, but a really central part of what they do and the programs that they offer, and that they have good and deeply embedded links with employers, regionally as well, and on a sectoral basis in areas that they're strongly active in. And that area of promotion, where it really needs to be available at all levels of the system. People need to have those progression opportunities, and apprenticeship is not just for school leavers. It's for a much broader range of people. Trudy talked a bit about the visibility of opportunities, and clearly people do struggle to find apprenticeship opportunities. There's a lot of word of mouth, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it does mitigate against really selling apprenticeship in a way where people can clearly pursue their areas of interest. So that visibility of opportunities is a major theme coming through. But so also is the idea of access in that more let's say that more narrow sense, in terms of those groups that haven't been as visible in apprenticeship as they should be. Obviously, there's a gender issue in apprenticeship. Needless to say. There are also issues around the sort of socioeconomic mix and the ability for people coming from disadvantaged backgrounds to access apprenticeship opportunities, people with disabilities, and how the additional supports can be given, whether that's to prepare themselves to make them make them compete more successfully for apprenticeship opportunities, but also the supports that people need through their apprenticeship, and why that and during the period of learning. There was a huge amount of practical suggestions made in this area, and a lot of what we're engaging with here are very, and actually across all of the areas, around very practical ideas and suggestions. So it's come through very strongly in the access space, but also more broadly, and all of that is informing the process as we move towards kind of putting flesh on the bones. So we frame these are very much draft objectives at this stage. We're moving towards a process now where we start to get more specific under each of these objectives around the kinds of initiatives and actions that can ensure that we achieve these objectives. There's also, we think, probably a need for a very clear and bold, attractive kind of vision statement around apprenticeship as well. And so if these statements don't necessarily seem inspirational in themselves, it's because they do need to address a very detailed set of arrangements. But we also acknowledge that there is a need to be to be more inspirational sometimes, perhaps, in terms of how we talk about apprenticeship and how it's presented in the context of the plan. We are hopefully that demonstrates that we've been listening to what we've heard, what we've been told through the submission process and through the two substantial surveys that were undertaken. We are very interested, obviously, in terms of what people think about the objectives themselves, and and people have an opportunity to send back feedback on that. As we move into the questions and answers, I mean, clearly people may have questions about this part of it, about the objectives. They may have questions around some of the specific material that you've heard in terms of the feedback and the consultation process. But you will also presumably have questions about apprenticeship more generally, and around where we take it. So we'll move maybe more towards the questions and answers process. I might just ask Trudy to just say a couple of words around how the question and answer functionality operates now within the platform that we're using. And hopefully then we, as panelists, can answer a lot of these questions today, but you can be assured that we'll also be capturing all the questions, and we'll be feeding back responses after today as well.
Hi, thanks very much, Phil. Yeah, I'm hoping at this stage everyone can see a Q&A box down at the bottom right-hand side of their screen, or somewhere if they're using a phone at the moment. If we could just ask people who are posing questions, if you wouldn't mind putting the organisation that you're representing, if you are representing an organisation, at the beginning of your question. We will endeavour to answer as many as we can here now, but I think we have about, so she's stopping to look at the number, 101 people on at the moment, so we may not get through to all of them. So I think we'll kick off now, and there's a couple of in already, and they are a very, very straightforward one, probably Phil for yourself at the moment, where there are a number of specific recommendations were made within a submission. Will there be an opportunity for stakeholders to engage with the department as regards how these will be addressed? And another one saying, are we offering employers opportunity to engage further prior to final plan agreed? So what are the next steps for the consultation?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Trudy, and thanks for the questions. We can't commit, as people will probably understand why, to get back in touch individually around all of the proposals and suggestions made. There's a huge depth of suggestions and proposals. But certainly people can be assured that all of them are being worked through systematically in terms of informing the plan. We will be engaging with some of the representative organisations, and we'll be reaching out to them as we're kind of moving towards the particular recommendations, and I mean particularly recommendations that are of key interest to those to those organisations. But we'll be doing that really as we're kind of in the more informal way, as we're seeking to clarify input and developing up plan content. There's a huge amount of kind of thematic coherence across the across the submissions, and all of that will be reflected within the action plan. We have lots of specific suggestions that are kind of variations on particular themes, and obviously as we will have to frame up what we think is workable and in navigating and engaging engaging with them. But all of those sorts of key themes that you've seen coming through, and you've seen coming through in the submissions, all of those will be dealt with in the action plan. That's not to say specific proposals are all going to be represented clearly. Clearly, that's not the case. But certainly, the issues that are raised will all be addressed in the context of the plan itself.
I think what we have is, and sorry, Matt, I'm going to read that out as a comment rather than anything, as an idea. Can MNCs and larger contractors be incentivized to work with their second-tier SME suppliers to increase the recruitment pool and to provide more diverse work experience opportunities for apprentices? I think that's actually quite a good idea. I'm not sure whether any of the panel want to respond.
I might just say, sorry, there's been a couple of, there is actually an example, and I suppose this is part of the thing around, learning across apprenticeships. There is, albeit at a relatively modest scale, there is a shared apprenticeship model in some of the craft apprenticeships, and I think a number of the submissions, and indeed John mentioned it also in the SME survey, mentioned the potential for apprentices to spend time across a number of workplaces. There is an example of that, as you say, in the craft side, and there's I think different flavors of that may be possible depending on the structure of different apprenticeships. We do, of course, we're very aware of the need for apprentices' status as employees, and having a primary employer to be respected, and that apprentices need to be protected through this process. But obviously, anything that adds, both to the ease that SMEs might engage with the process, particularly, and also the quality of the learning as a result of diversity of workplaces for the apprentices. Obviously that we will certainly be looking at that in the context of the.
You're going to have to forgive me if I join some questions up here. And here's one dealing with the higher education sector in two areas. One is Jim from Thea. So do you think the conditions exist to encourage HEIs to place apprenticeship at the heart of the missions? And I suppose one that's linked and slightly not linked is the challenge for the IoTs in attracting CAO applicants into level 6 and level 7 programs. And could employer support for apprenticeships help address the imbalance? So can we place apprenticeship at the heart of the institutions, and could apprenticeship provide a solution to level 6, level 7?
I'll come in on that, Trudy. The skills agenda, as we all know, needs to be and is at the centre of government objectives and the department's objective around the higher education system. Of course, there's a very important sort of issue around, I suppose, change and cultural change in the way our institutions operate. Clearly, in talking about the technological sector and where it's originated from, I suppose you could certainly make the case that the apprenticeship model is much more sort of embedded or core to that world. But we know from all our work with colleagues in the university sector, there's a strong appreciation of the importance of employment relevant higher education. And I mean, the challenge that we're trying to, when I say a challenge, it's a challenge and it's an opportunity at the same time, is kind of build on the best, which reflects things like the established tradition of apprenticeship in this country, what we've learned, what we've developed over a very short time frame under the first action plan to put in place the new apprenticeship model, and then bring it into a very fluid and very dynamic and kind of reforming higher education system. You read about COVID and the impact of COVID and, discussions about the new normal and all of that. I suppose all the evidence is that what COVID has done is highlight the underlying trends and accelerated underlying trends that are driving reform in tertiary education more generally. And the trick is, and through the work that we're carrying out on the action plan, to build on that knowledge, to build on that understanding, to build on that sort of established expertise and experience to ensure, and maybe it's, won't commit to saying that the apprenticeship model would be at the core, but should be very close to the heart. And we know in terms of the way that higher education programs have developed over the years, that focus on employment relevant education and the focus on employability of graduates. And is there any better model to deliver on that potential than the apprenticeship model? So, what's really reassuring is the way that the higher education system has, and inspiring confidence in the next action plan and the delivery of its objectives, is the extent to which the apprenticeship model has become embedded across the higher education system. And I suppose our objective, our goal is to build on that. Sometimes I think that, and it's a theme that we've talked about before in different events, that we can get a little, there's always a risk of being hidebound by the kind of the institutional framework within which you're bringing forward these important initiatives. To the learner, to the employer, whether it's a kind of traditional kind of, the sector of the tertiary system within which the training education happens isn't relevant. It's the outcomes and it's the skills and it's the capabilities and abilities of people who come through the tertiary system. And that's something I think that we need to continue to focus on and not find ourselves in any way impeded by institutional, any kind of, inflexibilities in how we conceive of or how we think of the higher education and the further education system.
Thanks very much, William. I'm just going to pull one that I see here coming through from the chat. So if I can ask people just so that we don't have to keep flicking in their screens here, could I ask that people use the Q&A tab and not the chat tab? But just one coming through on chat here. Are we going to set participation targets for underrepresented groups as part of the action plan? Do you want me to pick on somebody?
I suspect we will end up with targets because it's an issue that government the minister are very focused on. So it's nothing like a target to stimulate action and energy around an issue. So I suppose our objective would be to ensure that those objectives are ambitious, but they're achievable. We want to avoid a situation, I suppose, that targets are set that everybody looks at and said, that they're sort of almost of a notional quality. But Phil might have his views on that.
And sorry, Phil, I'll just add in there before you answer. There were some questions about how can apprenticeship be promoted to the marginalised groups, but that's probably linked into the targets and the development of the plan.
Yeah, clearly the government have already set us an overall target. The programme for government says 10,000 annual apprenticeship registrations by 2025. In 2019, we were at just over 6,000. So so there's a distance to go there on the global side. I think the likelihood is that the minister and government would be keen to sort of supplement that with targets around participation for underrepresented groups as well. Not sure what those targets will be. Clearly, they need to be ambitious but deliverable, as William said. In terms of how apprenticeship is promoted, it's a kind of an interesting one, and I mean, people will have heard me say this before. For the most part, there's a lot of interest in apprenticeship. The difficulty and the constraints has tended to be more around securing sufficient recruitment activity by employers. And I suppose in answering the question around interest in apprenticeship for underrepresented groups, like we'll be certainly looking at the all of the suggestions that have come through from a number of the bodies that advocate strongly in that area, and clearly there are networks that we can use to extend our reach. There are also employers who are enthusiastic about engaging in this agenda as well. And obviously there are things that the education and training system can do in terms of preparing people for apprenticeship, and and it's important that we're using all the communications channels that we can, and obviously the visibility of underrepresented groups in our promotional material is important also. But I suppose in some ways that's only half the job, because you also need to ensure that the opportunities are there, that employers are that employers are offering those opportunities. And I mean, we can obviously look at how the system incentivizes that, how it promotes that, how we capitalize on some of the enthusiasm of employers in that area as well. And I suppose we also think that there's a role for the public sector in this plan, and that obviously cuts across all areas of the plan, including opportunities that might be available to people that perhaps the public sector doesn't engage as strongly as it should.
There's a quick question there that I can probably help respond to as well. Somebody looking to see when the next call for apprenticeship is going to happen, and the answer there is it's open on an ongoing basis. There are no more planned calls, so if you have an idea, then please do contact Solus and get that process started. There is information on apprenticeship.ie if anybody needs to pass on information to employers or consortia, or potential consortia, should I say.
I might just add to that, actually, it's important, and maybe to give Trudy a moment to actually have a look at the questions.
You're reading stuff up and down.
The fact, I suppose, and it's kind of interesting because that question is asked, and we see it in a few different settings. So it obviously that message is not getting through. That we're sort of we're open for business potentially in terms of the development of new apprenticeships on an ongoing basis. So I think there is a message in that, in terms of how clear is it? How clear is it in terms of where you go? And obviously, there's a number of our agencies have a role at higher education authority primarily. But I think there is a message in that around how clearly that's communicated, how awareness is promoted, you know, so just maybe to make the point, there's the simple answer, but I mean, I think there's a message coming from the question as well.
We have a couple of questions and comments in on, I suppose, the international dimension or any potential international dimension for apprenticeships. So has any consideration been given to opening up access to apprenticeship to employers in Northern Ireland who don't have a presence in the South? And then the potential for opportunities for apprenticeship mobility in Europe. And I think that's something that probably needs to be looked at in the dim and distant future. And is that you waving your hand?
Yeah, sorry, Trudy, that actually was a theme that came through in some of the submissions as well. Actually, the possibility of Erasmus Plus does provide the opportunity, you know, for mobility, both for the staff and for apprentices. And it was, yeah, we had quite a detailed submission in from Lergos on that, which covers those points.
And I think it's part of the European agenda for apprenticeship as well.
Yeah, within the overall.
Yeah, I mean, Trudy, you could well imagine, just in the context of, you know, the focus on enhanced cross-border cooperation and on skills in particular, which is, you know, evidently an area of common interest, that those kind of issues would rise to the surface, you know, notwithstanding obviously institutional issues and the jurisdictional issues that play out in terms of how you would facilitate cooperation. But I mean, it's an obvious area because it's very practical and it's very relevant, you know.
We have one here from Aidan Kenny. How can quality apprenticeship career pathways be underpinned by regulation requiring certifications to carry out work?
It's a
very technical one for me to throw at you late in the evening.
Yeah, I think I suppose and I mean there's obviously a broader set of kind of stakeholders, you know, well beyond this department around the question of regulation, you know, right the way across, you know, industry and obviously, you know, there are a number of regulated activities across, you know, within you know, relevant to apprenticeship. And in fact, you know, Aidan, you're certainly not wrong to identify a connection between regulation and you know, the scope for apprenticeship. I mean, you know, the auctioneering apprenticeship is a good example of one that, you know, has a fair bit of its genesis in a change in regulation and qualification requirements for people operating in that sector. However, the question of whether the you know, one should regulate specifically for the purposes of promoting a particular mode of learning, as opposed to kind of, you know, that you should regulate because regulation is the right thing to do in terms of, you know, whether it's, you know, safety, quality of you know, etc. So you've a hugely diverse set of organisations who are making decisions around, you know, whether a particular activity, you know, should require a specific qualification in order to undertake it. I think maybe apprenticeship needs to be aware of where it may be able to play a role in supporting regulation, and also where opportunities arise to develop apprenticeships in areas which are, you know, where compliance and regulation are becoming more prominent. And some, you know, some of that includes not just, you know, it can be broader compliance questions in an area like financial services and a whole range of other things. So I think that's important. I think that's important that we have an eye to that all of the time. Whether something like an apprenticeship plan put out by a Department of Further and Higher Education should in itself state a desire for greater regulation, you know, in areas of industry and all of that, is maybe, you know, maybe that's not quite as clear, you know. So
thanks, Phil. I think we're getting a bit late now, so I think we'll take maybe two or three more, and then we'll call it a day, if that's okay. Just to let people know that we will look at all the questions that have come in that weren't particularly answered, and we'll look at doing just a summary afterwards, and we'll circulate that. Question: the demand for apprenticeship in general has been cyclical, most recently in 2010. High demand, like presently in certain areas. So has the panel any idea on how this should be addressed with high demand, for example, electrical and plumbing? So not leading to a future oversupply of skills in the area. We're getting very detailed now.
I don't think we've succeeded in abolishing the economic cycle, but I might ask colleagues in the Department of Finance for their advice on that. I mean, it is a very significant issue. It's a challenge, and I know it's challenged the system as it's played out, you know, let's say in the wake of the 2008 crash, and then more recently in the COVID, And I suppose there's it relates to that broader issue of how do we ensure a kind of systematic, structured approach to training and education in our enterprises, you know, across the economy. Because I mean, the big challenge, you know, it's when the economy is most stressed or is subject to significant stress that, you know, you would not wish to see kind of education and training spend or initiatives take a hit, but that's what inevitably happens. So when we talk about sort of smoothing the business cycle, I suppose there's that question of how we smooth the training cycle, because as everyone will know, or as people will know on this call, you want to set up a solid foundation for the move out of recession and a downturn. I talked earlier about the kind of acceleration of trends that COVID has demonstrated. Question that we need to be asking now, although we're in mid-November, sort of in the middle of wave 2 and sort of, you know, in level 5 lockdown. And I know it's a big challenge because people have to, you know, concentrate on the viability of their businesses coming out of that scenario. But the kind of the more long-term structural impacts of COVID will come into play as we move out of the pandemic. And the question for us, the challenge for us as a department and for the training agencies, for the higher education system, for stakeholders, for businesses, is how we ready for that. So no, that's a very kind of broad answer to a specific question, but it does, I think the question does raise an important point about the risk that education and training becomes too much, you know, is too driven by the economic cycle, and that doesn't provide a basis for sustainable long-term economic growth.
Thanks, William, and Mark from TU Dublin was getting in there as well. With, you know, do the HEIs have the necessary flexibility to expand and contract, kind of with those cycles?
Well, I mean, the consistent sort of, you know, it's been reflected, I think, in the advice that the National Skills Council endorsed from the National Training Fund Advisory Group that's enterprise-led, is that strong focus on agility, responsiveness, flexibility. That's been very demonstrated through initiatives like the Human Capital Initiative. I know the July stimulus, we're very happy with the response of the higher education system in terms of the modular skill provision, which provides, I think, an enormous potential for a kind of a more flexible approach to HE. You know, question arises how that then dovetails with kind of, you know, what we're talking about this afternoon, the new apprenticeship model. But you see, I suppose apprenticeship, what it kind of highlights to me, and why it's another particularly interesting aspect of the model, is it kind of highlights that, I mean, when somebody does an apprenticeship, completes an apprenticeship and goes into the kind of career pathway that's created for them, you want them to continue cycling back to education and training. You know, want to avoid any kind of scenario that we see education and training as once and done. So how the apprenticeship model helps support a kind of a more embedded approach to, you know, that awful cliche, lifelong learning or permanent learning. I think that's a really interesting issue to explore.
Thanks very much. And just the very last one for anyone who isn't following the chat and the Q&A, as we move on, And William, I'm going to target you again for this very last one. So given your central government experience, would you agree that there's a potential to extend the apprenticeship cadetship model to the civil service? I know you've answered it in the Q&A, but if you'd mind kind of repeating for anyone who missed it.
Sorry, I started answering it and then ran out of character. So very quickly.
So we'll force you to talk about it.
Very quickly, I suppose, I mean, we have the proof of concept in the ICT apprenticeship. You know, it's been very successful in demonstrating the model can be made work. In the Civil Service Renewal Plan, there's reference to professional career streams for finance, for HR. You know, that's something that's amenable to that type of approach. It's like it's not a million miles away. That's the Irish Government Economic and Evaluation Service, where we seek to recruit people with specific skills in specific areas. That training, the training that people undertake before they take up IGES roles, I mean, it'd be very interesting to see how that can be refined to focus more on the specific skills that would be required in a civil and public service context. And of course, anybody of a particular generation would probably remember civil service competitions, kind of adult EO competitions going back maybe decades at this stage, where people were taken on and then sent off to college to do degrees and then taken back after they completed them, a very, very attractive option at the time. There was clearly a kind of earn and learn dimension to that. So absolutely, I mean, the short answer to the question is the civil service, public service should be, needs to be, and actually government will expect it to be very open to the apprenticeship model.
Okay, thanks very much, William. Sorry, I think we're almost ready to wrap up now. Phil, I don't know whether you have anything to add.
No, really, Trudy, I'm kind of conscious. I was only looking at the the full attendance list as the numbers were ticking up. Actually, I've spotted a couple of questions just there in the last minute or so, but I think we will wrap up as well. But the level of engagement has been fantastic. I just see that not only do we have Pat O'Doherty, the chair of the Apprenticeship Council, we also have his counterpart Paul Cremens, the chair of the National Apprenticeship Advisory Committee, is here. You know, we've the chair of Solus, Sean Aylward, as well. You know, and you know, it's great to see you know, people who have, you know, responsibility for kind of, you know, steering from a governance perspective different aspects of the apprenticeship system, and already give a huge amount of their time to the system. It's great to see them great to see them here and taking part today. As Trudy said, we'll be working through the Q&A. We'll be pulling the we will share responses with you. We also intend to share the submissions themselves, so people will have an opportunity to see those. And as I mentioned earlier, we will be in touch with some of you around, you know, clarification of certain issues and things that we might need some help with as we're moving through the drafting process of the plan. Hope you got a good sense of I suppose the broad directions maybe that we're going. What other people have been saying, that we have some additional richness coming through in terms of hearing the voice of apprentices themselves. We're in terms of time frame, our intention is to get the plan to the minister before Christmas. That probably means that, you know, in order for it to just work through that sort of, you know, approval, governmental kind of process and publication, and we're probably talking about the month of January in terms of it hitting the streets. So yeah, just to thank everybody for their time and for their input, and to my fellow presenters also as well. It's been and thanks to Trudy and my own team, particularly Kevin and Patricia, in terms of the work that they've put into today. It's been a lot going on in the background. Finally, thanks to the gods of technology, because the greatest of all of that is going to fall. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Bye.